conduction system. And the EKG, we're talking about how and why, step one, why the heart actually does what it does. So the way this works is your heart will actually contract. Remember, it's a muscle. And it will contract due to a series of electrical changes in the heart muscle. So you're going to have a bunch of electrical changes that are going to occur. That is going to cause your heart to contract. If you think all the way back to AMP1, if you were in my class, we talked a lot about this, but it's going to be depolarization. So we're thinking back to electrical changes. We're talking about this lovely little graph that is time, and you're going to have millivolts of your resting membrane potential. And we're talking about this type of graph all the way back. So electrical changes, think we start here, we're going to have an increase in our electrical potential, a decrease in our electrical potential, and a return to baseline. So that's the electrical changes we're talking about. The depolarization is this upswing. So that is going to be the world we're going to live in for about the next little bit. So also think back to AMP1 when we were talking about how the muscle cells are connected. So your muscle cells are all connected to each other via gap junctions. So they aren't connected by a desmosome, they aren't connected by being sewn together, they are connected by gap junctions. So that means if we have a muscle cell right here and a muscle cell right here, again, this is just a very generic perspective, gap junctions are referring to the fact that they are not isolated with the plasma wall between them. It means that they are actually connected via a tunnel that has a gap where you have simultaneous movement, or a better way to say that is continuous movement of the cytoplasm from one cell to the other. So with the cytoplasm moving from one cell to the other, whatever happens in cell 1 happens very quick in cell 2 because it doesn't have to cross over a plasma membrane through a space and into the plasma membrane of another cell. It is rapid and quick, and communication can happen like that, which is what you want when you have your heart contracting and this series of electrical changes. So when an electrical change happens in the first cell, it is a very rapid communication. The same thing will happen in the second cell, and then that will happen and so on, because he's connected to the next cell. So very, very rapid, continuous movement through the cytoplasm. The reason we really want this is because we want the entire myocardium to contract at the same time. Because if the myocardium does not contract at the same time, you are going to have issues with blood flowing through the heart and then blood flowing through the body. So in order to have all of your muscle cells contracting at the same time, they need to get the signal relatively at the same time. So that needs to be really, really rapid communication, and that happens via gap junctions. So just to kind of keep in mind with our myocardium and why we are connected the way we are. So the conduction system, you've got this really cool thing inside your heart called the intrinsic conduction system. And intrinsic is a term that means it's inherent, it is built in, it's automatic, it's not learned, it's not developed. Intrinsic, it is just there, it's inherent to the body itself. So what the intrinsic conduction system is, it is going to be the ability of the heart to beat without nervous system communication, or without the nervous system telling it to contract. So basically what this means is that there is an intrinsic, an inherent piece built into your heart that it allows the heart to beat without having the nervous system connected to it. So essentially your heart can beat without your brain telling it to, which is very, 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 very cool. And we know this to be true because your heart will actually continue to contract and continue to beat. And it will happen if all nervous impulses are removed. So how in the world does your heart have the ability to contract on its own without having the nervous system connected to it, telling the brain what the brain is telling it to do it? It's a very cool system. It's the intrinsic conduction system, and it is super fascinating. So we're going to talk about that. I do want to just go ahead and let you know that it is the ability of the heart to do this. The reason that your heart is connected to your nervous system, even though it has this ability, it is not fully removed from the nervous system because the nervous system can control your heart rate. There are times when you need your heart rate to speed up, slow down, be connected to your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous systems. So your heart needs to be able to match homeostasis and do what it needs to do to regulate your internal levels. However, it also has the ability to do it without that system telling it what to do. So it has both. It is connected to the nervous system, but it also has the ability to contract without it. We're going to talk about how it contracts without it. So the intrinsic conduction system will actually ensure synchronized contractions of all of your heart muscle. It's going to be in a sequential pattern, and it will be your atrium and then your ventricles. So we talked briefly about this in the exercise before this. It will be the top chambers and then the bottom chambers. So right and left are going to do it at the same time. We are going to contract in such a way that we are contracting the first section here and then the second section here. So we are going to have 1 and 2, top and bottom, atrium and then ventricles. And we're going to do it so that they contract as a unit. So there's a couple structures we're going to talk about. So we're going to take our heart, we're going to blow them up again. As a reminder, right, left, atrium, and ventricle. So right atrium is going to be this guy, left atrium is this guy, right ventricle is this guy, left ventricle is that way. So right here in the right atrium, you have a pocket of cells. And this pocket of cells is going to be called your SA node. I do not know why that got so big. Let's try that again. SA node. Ooh, wow. Okay, let's try that one more time. Sorry, I'm not used to these touch screens. This pocket of cells is your SA node. And your SA node stands for your sinoatrial node. Remember, it is in your atrium, so this is your SA, sinoatrial node, and he lives in your right atrium. You're also then going to have a pocket of cells that are going to be your AV node. So this guy right here will be your AV node. And your AV node stands for atrioventricular node. And he is on the line or right next to the line between your right atrium and your right ventricle. So that's your AV node. Next, you're going to have your bundle of, find a different color. You're going to have your AV bundles. So these guys are going to travel down right this way. And these are going to be your AV bundle branches. So not only do you have your SA node and your AV node, you're going to have your AV bundle branches. And this is going to be a pathway, essentially. It's a branch. And these bundle branches will go all the way down that intraventricular septum, so all the way down that line that is separating your atrium and your ventricle. So he's traveling all the way down that guy. And then what you're going to have is you're going to have the next section, you will have something called your Purkinje fibers, and they will be found in the bottom of your myocardium and the bottom of your right and your left ventricles. And these are called your Purkinje fibers. So one thing to keep in mind is this may have a different name depending on the edition of the book you are using. Purkinje fibers is named after the guy who discovered these, but they may also be called subendocardial conducting network fibers. So just keep in mind, but your book does also call them Purkinje fibers at one point as well. So the way this process works, it is a 4-step process. It is SA node to AV node to AV bundle branches to Purkinje fibers. So the way this process actually works is it's a really cool process. Your SA node is super, super important because what is going to happen is your SA node is called your pacemaker. And your pacemaker is going to set the beat of the heart. So the pacemaker is going to set the beat of the heart. Remember, this is intrinsic, so this is without input from the nervous system. If someone has artificially had a pacemaker put in, they've undergone surgery, they have some heart condition, and they have an artificial pacemaker put in, essentially what they're doing is putting in artificial SA node cells into this area to set the rhythm of the heart. So it's very, very cool. So what happens is your SA node just has an internal heartbeat. And this SA node is the pacemaker, and he will set the rate and beat of your heart. So that's step 1. Step 2 is going to be your traveling down from your SA node to your AV node. So your pacemaker, your SA node is going to set the heart rate. Communication will travel from him to your AV node. And your AV node will actually send out branches on either side through both atrium. And as he sends communication out to the right and the left atrium, essentially he causes atrial contraction. So if you are standing in a line with all of your friends and you're all holding hands, and you squeeze hands one by one all the way down the line super, super quickly, everyone has gotten the communication to squeeze at the same time. Your AV node essentially sends little tiny offshoots down through the right and the left atrium and says contract. So you have atrial contraction. Then that communication goes from your AV node down through your 3rd step, which is your AV bundle. And as it's going down through these AV bundle branches, it's just traveling down the highway. What we are aiming for is the 4th step, which is actually going to be having the communication go through the Purkinje fibers. And just like the AV node was sending communication to the ventricles, the Purkinje fibers are sending communication to the ventricles. And he's specifically also doing the right and the left ventricles. So it's cupping the bottom of the heart, and it's cupping the myocardium at the bottom of the heart. And what happens with these Purkinje fibers when it gets this communication down to the right and the left ventricles, you will have something called ventricular contraction. So you're going to have the right and the left ventricles contracting at the same time. So this is the two-step process of your heartbeat, is atrial contraction and ventricular contraction. So you're going to contract your atrium, your right and your left muscles at the same time. Blood will get shoved down into your ventricles. Then you will contract your ventricles at the same time, and blood will get moved out of the heart. So this happens because communication starts at the SA node. It sets the pacemaker, sets the beat of the heart. It communicates to the AV node. The AV node sends its little branches out to the atriums to tell them to contract. And then it also sends communication down through your bundle branches, your AV bundle branches. That gets sent out to your Purkinje fibers, and then you are going to have contraction of your ventricles. So it is a two-step process, starting with first your atrium, and then your ventricles. So that's the pacemaker of the heart. What's interesting is, remember we said that this intrinsic conduction system was going to be electrical changes. So when we're talking about these electrical changes, these can actually be read by technology, which is really, really awesome. And they're actually going to be read, not by, but let's just say they are read through an EKG. So we can interpret these electrical changes because we can pick up these electrical changes in an EKG. So when we're talking about these electrical changes, again, we're talking about the depolarization. The depolarization, when we talked about this guy, depolarization is always followed by a period of then repolarization. Because remember, you have to have D to then have re, and essentially then you come back to whatever that baseline was. So this is the process of depolarization and repolarization. These are the electrical changes you see on the heart, and we actually can record them. And so these are going to be recorded through the use of an electrocardiogram. Electro, because we're doing electrical signals. Cardio, because we are doing the heart. So you'll see this as both an ECG or an EKG. They are actually kind of synonymous. Either one is kind of correct, but it's an electrocardiogram is technically what it is called, but ECG or EKG is used interchangeably. So how to read a generic EKG. Remember, we're talking about electrical potential, so if you did not like this part of A&P1, I apologize. We're not going to go too far into the weeds, but we are going to talk pretty deep with the knowledge that you should have already had from A&P1. So electrical changes are measured on a graph that looks like this. Let me just start over with that guy. These are measured on a graph that looks like this. You're always going to do time, usually in milliseconds, on the x-axis. So you're starting here and you're ending here. So that's kind of how that's work. It's a generic time, milliseconds or seconds. And then up on the y-axis, you're going to be measuring the potential or the change in electric potential. This is going to be measured in millivolts. So the potential is going to be measured in millivolts. If you think about a battery, 8-volt battery, 9-volt battery, AAA battery, all of those are the potential. They're all measured in a millivolts or a volts. They're measured in potential. So this is the traditional, what you will see. I'm going to change colors so it's a little bit easier. Your heart has a pattern that looks like this with a little bump, a downward, an upward, a downward, and back up, and a little bump. This is the traditional EKG that you will see. So the items that are called these, you are going to have waves and you're going to have segments. A wave is pretty simple. It's a time when you have a deflection up or a deflection down. It's a wave. A segment is where you are going to have straight. So that's a segment, and that's a segment. So we have waves and we have segments. Some of the important ones we're going to look at, waves and segments, is they're going to have some names. So this EKG actually has names for all of these waves and segments. You're going to have the P wave is measuring this guy right here. Then you're going to have the QRS waves. So the PQRS, P wave, then you're going to have the QRS wave, and then this is going to be the T wave. So all of these waves you are going to have, you have P, Q, R, S, T. PQRST. Then you're going to have some segments. So some of the segments we're going to talk about is going to be the P to the R segment. So essentially what we're saying is from the midpoint of the P wave to the midpoint of the R wave, this right here is going to have a specific measurement of whatever time we are saying the P wave to the R wave time frame is. So we're going to talk about P wave, PR segment. It's going to be one. And then the other one we're going to talk about is ST. So we're going to talk a lot about from this guy to this guy. And it is going to be the time frame associated with the S wave to the time frame associated with the T wave. And what you're looking at is going to be the time for S to T segment. So one other thing we're going to look at is going to be a section that is going to really be a connection of the segments that are going to be Q, R, S. So essentially for the QRS to go right on top of this guy, we're going to be looking for, I'm going to pick a different color because it's a little bit easier. You're looking for the section that is here, which is directly down the middle of Q. And you're going to be looking at this section to all the way down the middle of S. So this is going to be QRS. And this time frame right here is super important. So again, we're measuring electrical potential, but we're actually looking at is time. So with this EKG, we're doing an electrical potential. And what we are measuring is we are measuring the electrical activity of the atrium contracting. Remember that was step one. And then we're measuring the electrical activity of the ventricle contracting. That was step two. So atrium contracting, ventricles contracting. Remember, contraction is a muscle. A muscle contracts. A muscle contracts because it depolarizes. So your atrium is going to contract, but that actually is going to be atrial depolarization, if that makes sense. And then your ventricles are going to contract, and that will be ventricular depolarization. So we are actually looking at these as two different muscles. So they're going to have, it's one big muscle, but we're looking at them as two different time frames that they're going to contract. So your atrium are going to contract on one time frame, and contraction means that the electrical activity in the muscle is depolarizing, and your ventricles are going to contract at one time frame, which means that your ventricles are depolarizing. Also remember, every time you depolarize, remember when you have this lovely little guy, every time you depolarize, you have to repolarize. So we're going to go through a process of atrial repolarization. at some point. And then we're going to go through the process of ventricular repolarization. So we are not doing the heart as a whole. We are doing atrium and then ventricle. Your atrium will contract. That atrium is going to essentially depolarize, and then after it depolarizes, then it will have to repolarize. You're also going to have your ventricle contracting. It will go through ventricular depolarization, and then it will go through ventricular repolarization. So what's actually happening with these things, it is not 1, 2, 3, 4. It's more so 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're going to talk about that at a later section, but what I want you to get used to these terms is that when we are looking at, well, that was a very interesting color, our electrical potential through an EKG. Okay, so we are going to have P, Q, R, S, T. When we're looking at this guy, how do we put these two worlds together? So when you are actually going to have the P wave, so this guy right here, this is what you see on an EKG when you are seeing your atrium going through the process of depolarization. So when your atrium are actually contracting and you're seeing a depolarization in that electrical signal, it shows up on the graph in this P wave. Then you're going to have the QRS complex. And when you have the QRS complex, because it has both segments and waves, this is where you're going to have ventricular depolarization. So your ventricles are contracting, leading to an electrical change. That is a depolarization. Okay, so we did our depolarizations. One thing that's happening, you have your atrium depolarizing at the P wave. Right after a depolarization, there has to be a repolarization. That is happening at the same time as the QRS complex with the ventricular depolarization. That's why he has such an interesting up-down motion, is because your atrium are going through your top part of your heart is starting to relax and repolarize, whereas your bottom, your ventricles, are going through the process of so squeezing. So the top is relaxed and the bottom is contracted. It's a very complex system that we're going to talk further about in another exercise. And then since we have a depolarization, repolarization of our atrium, you also have to have depolarization, repolarization of your ventricles. So when does that happen? So ventricular repolarization is going to happen at T wave. And this guy is a very interesting wave, and because the QR complex with a D and a repolarization happening at the same time, your T wave is an upward deflection in your electrical graph. So sorry, not that one. Erase that. This one. Your T wave is indicative of your ventricles repolarizing. So what I would do for this exercise is go through and draw a couple EKG standards and just look at them, get used to labeling them, PQRST. Start looking at the intrinsic conduction system and how things contract from the top and the bottom, and then start putting them together. So remember, your heart beats and it does bump, bump, top, bottom, and then there's a little bit of time. And then there's bump, bump, and it's the top, bottom, and then there's a little bit of time. So your heartbeat is bump, 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 bump. When you look at the EKG, your heart rate is going to be bump, 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 bump. So this is 1, this is 2, this is 3. So this is your heart atrium ventricular. This is your heart atrium ventricular. This is your heart atrium ventricular. This is a heartbeat, top, bottom. This is a heartbeat, top, bottom, and this is a heartbeat. So that is how this all works together.